Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian Street. I'm Senior Vice President of Operations for the Castle Group. With me today, and I'll let them introduce themselves, we have Scott Harvey-Lewis, who's our engineering expert, and Roberto Blanche, who is our legal representation as well. Today, before we get started, I do want to address the Hurricane Ian that is going to be making impact to the state of Florida in the next several hours into tomorrow. I know probably several of you on this call are living in a potentially impacted area. So I just want to hopefully everybody stay safe. They're hunkered down, and this is how you're passing the time, is by learning about the structural integrity reserve studies and SB-4D. But again, it's a major storm. So I hope you and your families all stay safe as it's going to impact a significant amount of the state of Florida. So with that being said, I will let Scott introduce himself and then we'll get started with the presentation.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Lewis. I'm the president and owner of Building Mavens. We're an engineering firm that specializes in inspections and owner's representation. And personally, I've reviewed over hundreds of condominiums over the last decade, helping them through the recertification process that now is merging with the milestone process. So looking forward to a lively discussion, and I'm honored to be presenting with Brian and Roberto.
And I am Roberto Blanche, shareholder at Siegfried Rivera, practicing at the firm since 2001. Representing condominium homeowner association and co-ops throughout the southeast portion of the state of Florida, and pleased and happy to be in such good company with Brian and Scott. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. Well, as we get started, obviously, we have a quick and open-ended agenda. This will be a very free-flowing from the engineering standpoint, the legal standpoint, and I'll be chiming in with more of the property management standpoint and how it all interacts. I want to thank those that submitted a few questions early, but as the agenda stated, we will have a Q&A session. We have the Q&A portal open, and I'll be monitoring that as we go through if there's any kind of pending questions that you're looking to get resolved. Now, obviously, as everybody knows, every condominium is different from both size, layout, structure. Everyone is slightly different, even from the age of the certificate of occupancy. So there may be some things that we have to take offline as they may account for just a small portion of the overall group that's on this call. So that being said, SB-4D, the Senate Bill 4D, was recently released, and everybody's trying to get their arms around how does this impact our individual buildings, and what does it mean to you as a board member and or a homeowner. So I want to turn it over to Roberto to give just a kind of a brief update. What does it mean? What are some of the nuances of the bill that are coming through? And then we'll get an engineering perspective on how they impact the buildings.
Thanks, Brian. So Senate Bill 4D was enacted by the legislature in response to the catastrophe that occurred at Surfside with the Champlain Tower South, and the calls from around the state that there had to be some type of intervention with regard to requiring those residing in buildings that were comparable to that tower, and to make sure that their boards of directors and property managers would ensure that the buildings were safe and that such an event would not arise. There was many commissions and groups formed throughout the state. The Florida Bar had one, and task forces were put together, and recommendations were submitted to the legislature as to the types of laws that should be enacted. And in a special session organized last year, the legislature adopted several changes to the laws that govern condominium associations and co-op associations in the state of Florida. And they generated two main requirements. They introduced the concept of milestone inspections, and they also introduced the concept of structural integrity reserve studies. Now, in condominiums and co-ops, we've always been familiar with the concept of reserves, and we know that reserves were required to be included in budgets by your board of directors for deferred maintenance and capital expenditure, projected capital expenditure expenses for roof, painting, and pavement, as well as any other building component for which the deferred maintenance and capital expenditure was estimated to exceed $10,000. Those reserves, however, were waivable by the unit owners, by vote of the unit owners, or the funding required by statute could have been reduced by vote of the unit owners. And furthermore, the unit owners would also be able to vote to use or authorize the use of those reserve funds for other purposes. Now, the legislature created this concept of structural integrity reserve studies, and of course, Scott will go over the list of items that are to be included in that reserve study. But the distinction is that when you adopt those reserves and include those in your budgets, they're going to be non-waivable, and the use of the funds accumulated in those categories are going to be unable to be used for other purposes, even if the unit owners wanted to vote for those. Now, milestone inspections, by contrast, are periodic inspections of a building's structural soundness and life safety integrity, let's call it. And those inspections are also supposed to be periodic and are divided into two phases. One, the first of which is a visual inspection, which Scott can also elaborate upon in the moments to come. And to the extent that the building passes muster, let's call it, and that's not a legal term, to the standards that the engineers and architects would uphold those inspections, then that's where the inspection stops. Phase one. Phase two is required only if circumstances are somewhat more dire. And again, this is supposed to provide boards and managers and unit owners and tenants an understanding of the existing structure and what required maintenance or repairs are necessary for a building, whereas a structural integrity reserve study is supposed to give us an understanding of how we can budget for certain structural and other types of components for our buildings.
Excellent, thank you. And Scott, Roberto mentioned, milestone inspections in the structural integrity reserve. Can you go in a little bit more into detail on what is included in a milestone inspection? And then we'll get into some of the dates as, what the law and the Senate bill basically came out and said when these things need to happen.
Sure. So the milestone inspection by law is a structural safety inspection divided into two phases. So if the building is structurally sound and has no substantial structural deterioration, which is defined by the law right now, then it's just a visual inspection that a licensed architect or engineer can perform. And if there's no structural deterioration found that's significant, then the building can be passed and you go on to the next 10-year mark after that. If there is substantial deterioration found, then a phase two inspection is required, which is investigations that go beyond just visual to determine the extent of deterioration. One thing that's of note, and I think many people ask the question, is for counties like Miami-Dade, Broward, and even some municipalities in Palm Beach, how does the recertification process tie in? And so those counties and those local jurisdictions have merged the two. So some milestone inspections in those counties will include an electrical inspection for safety. And they all also have some more rigorous requirements that the structural portion can only be done by a licensed threshold. So I think on that side of the fence, it's pertinent for any condominium to check with the local jurisdiction, because the law can be changed in essence based on the governing jurisdiction. So again, not to lose a point, a milestone, two phases. Phase one, if the building is visually sound, no substantial deterioration, you can be passed. The law says a licensed architect or engineer in general can do it. Local jurisdictions may change it and be more stringent. If a phase 2 is required, that's a more intensive investigation that depends on what's found that's causing that deterioration.
Great. And Scott, what are some of the components in the visual inspection or even the further phase 2 inspection? What are some of those components that they're looking at as it relates to, we had a question come in, about the walls of the building, which then you get into some of the questions about, the building envelope itself and how is that all tying together?
Well, since it's a structural safety inspection, you're going to be looking and focusing at the primary structural members. So foundation, load-bearing walls, shear walls, the roof deck itself, anything that's really supporting load and tends to lead towards the integrity of the building. So balconies and so forth. The code or the law says that you're not focusing on cosmetic issues like cracked stucco or cracked paint. It's not to get into the weeds there, but it definitely is looking at the structural integrity of the building.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. And, Roberto, one of the pieces that was addressed in the law was the due dates and actually which buildings this law actually impacts. So can you just describe some of those details? It's in buildings over 3 stories, things like that. So which buildings are impacted by the law? And then what are the upcoming due dates for those first inspections, milestone inspections?
Sure. So first and foremost, let's consider the mandatory structural inspections. So those milestone inspections. The structural inspections must be performed by an engineer or architect, and they are to be performed with regard to each building on the property governed by a condominium or a cooperative association that is 3 stories or more, so equal to or greater than 3 stories. These are to be commenced when the honor before they are supposed to be submitted on or before December 31st of 2024. There is a distinction, however, that somewhat of a probably an unintended gap, which is buildings that are 30 years or older as of July 31st of 2022. So if they got their CO July 1st of 1992, then they become 30 years old when this bill becomes effective, which was July 2022. Those buildings have to get their reports, their milestone inspections performed on or before December 31st of 2024. If you are a building that is within 3 miles of the coastline, then you need to have your inspection performed as of your 25th year. So as of the 25th year from your building's certificate of occupancy. And so there are some buildings that might achieve that criteria, i.e. 25 years from CO prior to December 31st of 2024. And based upon the current wording of the statute, if you are within 3 miles of a coastline as defined by the statute, and you are 3 stories or more, it is possible that you might be in a unique class of buildings that might have to have their milestone inspection performed prior to December 31st, 2024. Okay, and then every 10 years after those dates, so every 10 years after you've performed your first mandatory milestone inspection, you're going to have to do another one. Okay, so that is with regard to the milestone inspections. And of course, we've discussed it earlier, Brian mentioned it, that the legislature, of course, at any given point in time can create new laws that might clarify this. So we're discussing what the statutes currently provide. We really can't speculate what's going to be in a glitch bill or future bill because, while we can speculate, it's anybody's guess what the legislature ultimately may end up doing. when and if they adopt new laws. So we need to look at these things as to how they sit and how they stand right now. With regard to the structural integrity reserve studies, they must be completed for buildings that are 3 stories or greater as of December 31st, 2024. So if you are on a budget cycle, that is a calendar year cycle, you would have a budget that would be adopted on or before, or would be effective for the fiscal year that would commence January 1st, 2025. You're going to have a structural integrity reserve study completed by December 31st, 2024. And what's critical about this is that reserve study that is required now by law to be completed on or before December 31st, 2024 for buildings that are 3 stories or higher, it's going to spell out reserve figures that are going to be required for various building components. And these boards for condos and for condos and co-ops, not for homeowner associations, will be presented with figures that must be included in your reserves. And presumably those reserves would have to be included in your budgets that are included for the 2025 fiscal year. And with that being said, many condos and many co-ops do not have currently reserves because they may have chosen to fund them at a level less than that which was required by statute, or in the alternative, they may have voted to waive reserves. And some condos just don't have adequately funded reserves, even though they haven't had votes. So what this is going to introduce now is a new series of building components for which reserves must be funded, and owners must be assessed for those reserves, and they're not going to be waivable. And if your building historically has not funded reserves or has waived reserves or has inadequately funded reserves, then you're going to be presented with a dilemma. And your dilemma is, how are you going to fund that? It might be, depending on the age and condition of your building components that need to be included in the structural integrity reserve study, it may be that you're going to have to assess a very large portion toward those structural integrity reserves, or in the alternative, it might not be as bad as some might speculate. So the question becomes, what do we do now? What do we do in this period of time between now and the fiscal year commencing January 1st, 2025? What do we do now to put ourselves in the best position to understand how bad of a hit this might be for our buildings, given the historical reserving or funding of reserves that our buildings may have had? And so now might be a critical time to look into what we may want to do proactively to make this less of a burden.
Excellent, thank you. So, Roberto, as you were going through some of the requirements, on a 3-story building, a few of the questions that were submitted earlier and in our Q&A chat had to do with, if I'm a condominium association made up of multiple buildings, some are 2, some are 3, some are 4, but they all fall under the master association. Is the entire master association responsible for just the buildings that are 3 stories and above, or how would that play out for those associations? Or we have another example, the bottom floor, the bottom 2 floors are garages, and then you have a single story or 2 stories above. How would that, is the garage basically included in the overall height of the building itself? Okay,
so for purposes of determining the 3 stories or more, I believe they are 3 stories of habitable structures, or 3 or more stories, and I'll get that exact wording from the statute momentarily so that I'm not misquoting, the language that is used. But with regard to the number of buildings on the property, some condo associations, and even though there aren't too many co-ops in the state of Florida, some co-ops may have multiple buildings, and those buildings may be comprised of different heights or different stories. So the statute only requires that the milestone inspection and the structural integrity reserve studies apply to buildings that are 3 stories or more. So if you have a condominium or cooperative building that is 2 stories or less, then you're not required. Nothing says you can't do it, but you're not legally required to complete a structural integrity reserve study or a milestone inspection for those buildings that are less than 3 stories in height. Depending on what your governing documents provide, it is possible that the association as a whole will have to fund the required costs of the reserves and of these studies, irrespective of whether you are an owner within a building that is less than 3 stories tall. So, but your governing documents may create other circumstances that may speak differently as to how these things get funded. So it is important to look at your governing documents and determine what is required with regard to the cost allocation of having those reports and those inspections performed. Who's going to pay for the cost of hiring the engineer and the architect, and then also who's going to fund, as it relates to structural integrity reserve studies, who's going to fund those reserves. Because in the absence of any provision in your governing documents to the contrary, then the statutes contemplate that it would be a common expense in general of the building. So even if you don't reside within those 3 stories or higher structures, you might be required to fund those costs and those improvements. And I will get back to you, Brian, momentarily on the exact wording for the 3-story structures so that I'm not misquoting the statute.
Excellent, thank you. And again, obviously, like we mentioned early on, every building is slightly different. And so highly recommend that you reach out to your own association legal counsel for guidance as we go through this process. Scott, from the engineering standpoint, we're getting a few questions on, with the phase 1 inspection, and a lot of things that were included, the foundation, the walls, and things that were listed as now we're going to have to reserve for. How would we inspect those? Is it, if we are reserving it, and Roberta, you may want to chime in on this as well, if we are reserving for, say the foundation of a building, you can't quite replace the foundation without taking out the entire building. So, what type of inspection, both from a phase 1 visual to the phase 2, would we do? And then how would that impact the overall, structural integrity reserve study as it relates to the wall and foundation items?
Well, with the structural integrity reserve study, I think Roberta touched on it briefly, but the difference with that, as opposed to older reserve studies, is that now you have these components that are put in and listed in the law, that the load-bearing walls, primary structure elements, the floors, foundations, fireproofing, plumbing, electrical systems. There's now a laundry list that's been included, and it still has a caveat at the bottom that says and anything over $10,000 in cost. So I saw a question pop up about elevators not being listed on that. However, the refurbishment or replacement of an elevator is going to be over $10,000 and beyond, right? So a prudent reserve specialist would put that in the reserve over a 30-year period for sure. In terms of inspection, usually when there's distress in a foundation or issues with concrete, walls, decks, roofs, there is visual evidence that you can see in walk-in buildings, and that will prompt you for additional work, whether it be testing the concrete, whether it be roof moisture surveys, cutouts of the coverings or the waterproofing systems to view the deck. So that would be leading into phase 2. How do you reserve for that amount? Well, if there is a project that is coming up that you can identify in a phase 2, like a waterproofing project, the best way would be to garner bids from engineering documents and to get the true cost of the project. What's really tricky right now for most is, how do you reserve, let's say the building is just hitting the 10-year mark or so on, reserve for the foundation, the walls, the load bearing, because as you mentioned, it's not logical to think that you're going to replace the building. I think that component is very subjective right now. More likely than not, it's going to be clarified in these upcoming glitch bills. However, if somebody said to me, how do you reserve for it? Then I would lean back on maybe the Florida building code, the existing building code that says that only a certain percentage of the building can be altered or repaired without triggering, let's say, a retroactive look at the code. And that usually falls between 20 to 30%. So if I was advising somebody over the long term that they may want to reserve a portion, maybe 20 to 30% over the life of a building, 50 years and beyond, to somewhat be prepared for a major restoration project of some sort. Again, that's not in the code. That's simply just what I would deduce from everything so far. And more likely than not, this piece will be clarified in upcoming bills.
Excellent. I do want to clarify, we had a couple of questions come in. Specifically, obviously, we threw out a lot of dates, did a lot of phase 1 inspections. One of the questions was, if I'm a 30-year-old condo right now, the phase 1 inspection is due before 12/31 of 2024. Is that correct?
Can I'll touch that with a practical example, and I showed both Roberto and Brian. Buildings are getting notices right now, right? And the notice for this particular building said, you're up for your milestone and you have 6 months to do it. So if you are 30 years as of this date, you may get a notice any day, right? You may have enough time for the 2-year mark, but it really is dependent on the jurisdiction right now. And some jurisdictions are ahead of others. So definitely if you're in Broward County, Miami-Dade County, and some parts of Palm Beach County, they have a more sophisticated process that's already underway, meaning the recertification process. It's already been amended to drop it back to 30 years. And there's lists that are generated yearly. So you just because it says 2024 right now, if you are 30 years already, there is a chance that you could receive a notice soon. And I think that would be prudent for the managers, the engineers dealing with that building to maybe look into it so they can get ahead of that notice, because once you receive it, now you're on the clock.
Yeah, and I do want to chime in on that as well. To get back to an earlier point, Brian, with regard to the height of the buildings, all that the statute speaks to, it says that both the milestone inspection as well as the SIRS, the Structural Integrity Reserve Studies, must be performed, and I'm quoting here, for each building that is 3 stories or more in height, period. So to your point, it doesn't get into subterraneous or below, ground level stories or levels of a building, but it says a building that is more than 3 stories or more in height. As to the milestone inspections, it further says that it does not apply to a single family, 2-family, or 3-family dwelling with 3 or fewer habitable stories above ground. So that's an exempt set of properties, but a condominium building or a co-op building that is 3 stories or more and is comprised of more than a 1, 2, or 3-family habitable structure would presumably have to get it if it's 3 stories in height. I presume that that means from the ground up, but the statutes don't really elaborate upon that. So I did want to touch base on that.
Excellent. No, thank you for the clarification. So there's been a lot of chatter on here about the actual reserve study itself. A lot of people have sent in numerous questions on, obviously now we have the standard set of reserve items that have previously been discussed, the painting and things of that nature. And now we have the structural integrity reserve. Now, some of the ability of the board to determine, if it was a pooled reserve, does the board and or the membership have the same authority to pool the reserves for the structural integrity reserve study? And then another follow-up question to that is, in years past, you were actually able to, even from a short-term borrowing standpoint, you borrow from one, but you have to repay it back, a little rob Peter to pay Paul for a certain project that came up out of the reserves, but they all had to be, accounted for. Is there anything built into the law as it pertains to the structural integrity reserves for our boards in order as they start to build their budgets for both 2023, 2024 and beyond?
I think that's going to be more of a, I think we're going to have to deal with that more on a case-by-case basis, Brian, because the section of 718 and 719 in which the structural integrity reserve study requirements are established is referred to by, I believe it's the administrative code, wherein the concept of pooled and straight line accounting for reserves is addressed. And that section says any reserves required by 718, and it cites the statute and it says can be accounted for as pooled or straight line. So it gives you the authority there to do it. So on a reading of that provision, one would be led to believe that you could pool them. However, the statutes where structural integrity reserves are established do provide that you cannot use structural integrity reserve funds for purposes other than those designated structural integrity reserve purposes. I mean, let's talk about them specifically real quick. The statute says roof, load-bearing walls or other primary structural members, floor, foundation, fireproofing and fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical systems, waterproofing and exterior painting, windows, and a final catch-all provision, which is any other item that has a deferred maintenance expense or replacement cost that exceeds $10,000, and the failure to replace or maintain such item negatively affects the items listed in the earlier enumerated list of categories. So that is pretty broad and comprehensive of a list of items that must be included in the structural integrity reserve study. And so whatever in your condo or co-op building is left in the bucket of reserves that are now, let's call them the unrestricted reserves, for those items, the unit owners can designate the use of other of accumulated reserve funds for other items. If I am using a pooled account and my unrestricted reserves are in the same pooled account as my structural integrity reserves, then I would read the section of the statutes that establish structural integrity reserves as prohibiting the use of pooling those funds with the unrestricted reserve funds. Now, I think that is my interpretation of how I would guide my clients with regard to pooling versus non-pooling of reserve funds. Now, within the category of your structural integrity reserves, can you pool? Can you pool those funds? And once again, I don't know in practice how that's going to be achievable, because if I create an account today that includes these items for structural integrity reserves, and I need to use monies for my roof, but the monies that I originally budgeted for pursuant to my structural integrity reserve study is inadequate to address the cost of my roof repair or roof replacement, then if I were to be using the pooled method and dip into that fund for things that were intended for flooring or foundation or fireproofing and fire protection system, then am I not using those reserve funds for purposes other than for what they were intended? And I can't do that anymore because I can't get a unanimous vote. So unless the legislature clarifies this, or unless the administrative code addresses this, it might be difficult and maybe not possible to do pooled reserves, even though the code references your ability to do so.
Great. So it's you know, a lot of the chatter that's coming into the Q&A is really it's how can we properly reserve? And obviously, you know, everybody's a little nervous because, you know, especially with the term fully funded, what does that mean? You know, as we start to do inspections from a property manager, one of the questions was, you know, when if something is noticed, you know, as maybe deficient or in needing of repair and it's a reserve item, when does it need to be, you know, repaired or fixed? So from a property management side, I would say immediately, if you notice that there are some issues, maybe there's some spalling concrete, or maybe there's, you know, a leak in the pool, as Scott was alluding to, you know, maybe the waterproofing is past its useful life. You know, those things you should have, you're working with your manager, start putting almost a strategic plan together on when those items are going to be replaced. Obviously, funding those projects is a major undertaking, and this is helping kind of force that issue and no longer kick the can down the road on some of these major projects that, you know, some buildings have done in the past. They've waited. I think the tragedy that happened in Surfside opened everybody's eyes to it. You can't kick that can down forever. So we need to start preparing now, and that's what I believe the intent. I'm not an attorney, but I believe that's what the intent of this law really is. You know, some of the chatter is, will there be glitch bills? And we don't know. There could be, there may be, but I believe there's enough right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, for the boards to reach out to engineers like Scott and reach out to your attorney like Roberto to start the process. Have a visual inspection done. What do you see? Sometimes, you know, taking the blinders off from the resident of the board that walks the building every day and having a fresh set of eyes looking at the property is important from understanding what is occurring, what's happening. You know, you may walk through a garage and see the little stalactites coming down. Well, that means you have some water intrusion issues. Maybe the waterproofing is past its useful life, like I mentioned earlier. So, and that's when certain things need to be corrected. So that being said, a couple questions have come through on some specifics to their buildings. And Scott, maybe you can chime in on a couple properties have seawalls, you know, bridges, and maybe some nuances to their buildings themselves. You know, a seawall is, I would say, and I would argue that it is a structural element. It's holding, you know, certain things together, depending, especially where the building is located, on how it's standing. What are your thoughts on seawalls as it pertains to your visual inspection and how it pertains to this law?
Well, in terms of structural integrity, as Roberta touched on it, the list says if something could negatively affect the other, it should be included. So a seawall that sits close to a building, and if it fails, it could cause issues with the foundation, then yes, right? And then also a seawall, more likely than not, is going to cost more than $10,000 to replace or repair. So anything like a bridge, a seawall, for sure, if it needs repairs or has a let's say a lifespan that falls within a certain amount, it should be included in the reserve. For a milestone inspection, I think it'd be on a case-by-case basis, but it'd be hard for an engineer to see a bridge or a seawall that's in distress and not put that in the report, right? So I don't think the mindset should hedge on the law of, well, it's not in the letter, as opposed to the intent, which you mentioned, Brian, which is to have safe, habitable structures that are maintained well, and if possible, reserved in the right amount to replace or repair, right? So if a seawall needs repair, it should be repaired. If a bridge needs repair, it should be repaired. It shouldn't hedge on whether it was written down precisely, but from those questions and the examples, it would be covered under the structural integrity reserve study for sure. And then milestone, it would just be dependent on what the real condition is of the element.
Excellent. And then, Scott, when you're doing your visual and your phase 2 inspections, some of the questions that have come up, obviously it's windows as part of the law, and who owns the windows is always a question. Is it the unit owner or is it the building? And there's some gray area there. What type of inspection, what are you looking at when you're looking at the windows, the doors, if there's hurricane shutters, things of that nature?
Well, you're looking for structural distress, right? And being familiar with the recertification process, it's not a mechanism to bring the buildings up to code. So if the windows are in good condition, but let's say they're not impact rated or they don't have a covering, if that was okay at the time of being built, it's not to go retro on the building and say, no, you need to update all buildings because it's not safe. What you are looking for is structural distress. Any issue that would be prompted as a structural deterioration that needs to be addressed that affects the life safety of the residents. So a good example is during recertification, you'll see railings or guardrails on balconies that may be shorter than what the code requires right now. An engineer wouldn't flag that and say, well, no, you need to bring it from 30 inches to 36 inches to meet code, because that's not the intent of the inspection. So windows, as it's to do with the reserves, I think that would be more of the nuance for Roberto or the law to clarify, because most condos I know of, it's a unit owner issue, not a condo issue. But if they're saying windows need to be included, I don't know if that's to do with common areas versus the residences. That would be one of those items that's probably going to be clarified in an upcoming bill. But definitely, if we're doing inspections, we're looking at visual signs that there is either leakage that's leading to deterioration of the concrete or surrounding finishes that's causing real structural distress. With a roof, same thing. If there's leaking in the roof or a failed membrane that's causing distress to the actual structural deck, that would maybe prompt a phase 2, which may be a moisture survey or some other means to see how widespread this issue is. But like Brian mentioned, it's case by case, right? One question said there's no way that a building would pass a phase 1. I think that's incorrect, because if a building is well maintained, and let's say they have an engineer on staff that's intimate with the building and knows what's happened, I don't see why that engineer would say, no, you can't pass. If the building looks fine, has done the proper maintenance, repairs are well documented, and there's no signs, I don't see what the need would just be say, hey, let's do a phase 2 just to do it, right? There should be some real reason why you want to dig deeper in, not just to guess at it.
Excellent. Yeah, I was gonna ask that question from our engineer. I think that may be a contrarian type engineer looking always at the negative, that maybe the buildings that individual has looked at have go back to my kick the can analogy, and they haven't properly maintained their building, maybe deferred a lot of maintenance. But if a board is proactive and basically doing everything timely, from repairs and everything, potentially they would pass the phase 1 just because they've done everything right. But it is looking for those types of issues that could arise as the building ages. And again, it's a building is like a car. You have to do routine maintenance on the car. You change your brakes, you change your tires, you add oil, you do all those things. A building is no different. And there are just different components that need to be repaired and eventually replaced. Again, people are kind of getting into some of the more legal aspects of funding these projects, and obviously getting caught up on if the building has waived reserve funds over the years. They're clearly not going to be fully funded as it comes to the SIRS. Are there requirements based on how the law is written out to be fully funded by a certain date, or are we now just starting as a kind of point in time and now you are required to start funding?
Well, when you get these studies, they will give you a comprehensive list of the components that comprise the study. So the roof, what is the remaining useful life of the roof? And when it needs to be either repaired or replaced, what is the estimated cost at that time, in the end of its useful life? And what you do is you divide how many years you have between now and then, and the cost of that, and you come up with a yearly funding. So this year you've got to contribute X dollars to your reserve account, so that by the time you get to the end of the useful life, when you have to go out and spend the money and hire the contractors to do that work, you have enough money on hand. So by way of example, if the estimated remaining, if the estimated replacement cost of the roof is going to be $1 million, but you've got 10 years before you need to replace it, then next year, or let's pretend we're in 2025, right? The 2025 fiscal year will not have to fund $1 million for that roof. That will be the fully funded amount for that roof. Would be $1 million. You've got 10 years to get there from, in my example, from January of 2025. So the 2025 fiscal year, in this example, will only have to account for $100,000 for that building component. And then you do the same calculus for the load-bearing walls and other primary structural members. And God bless Scott and how he's going to do that, but I'm not going to have to do it. I'm just going to have to tell my clients, do what Scott said, and so you start coming up with how much do I need to fund in 2025 fiscal year, so that each one of these enumerated structural integrity reserve components are going to be funded at the level to which they need to be funded that fiscal year. And so that's how we're going to eventually get to the total amount that we need for each one of those building components. Now, for instance, my reserve study may say that for the fireproofing and fire protection system, I only have about 2 years remaining useful life left. And the cost for that is going to be $1 million at the end of those 2 years. So in 2025 and in 2026 fiscal years, I'm going to have to fund $500,000 each year just for my fireproofing and fire protection system. So it's all really going to depend on how much needs to be funded each year as of your reserve study, so that by the time you get to the end of the useful life for each one of those components, you will have enough money on hand to pay for that. I don't know if that answers the question, but I hope it does.
Well, I think, and then to further along in your, fire protection $1 million, you have 2 years, you've been underfunded, the ability for the association to then take out a loan and finance the repairs is still an option if they start to see, some failures in those different components. And I think that answers some of the questions that have come up. When do you have to make the repair? So,
Sure.
From Scott's standpoint, he'll do a reserve study analysis, and it says that you have the 2 years left of the useful life for the fire protection system. But that doesn't mean it's going to instantly fail the moment you hit that 2 year the end of that 2 year window. What it's saying is that based on, actuarial tables of how long pipes will last, how long different things will last, you have approximately, say 10 years overall in its life, and you're down to the last 2. But if you've properly maintained it, you tuned up the car every so often, and you're making sure things are done, it may last longer than that, conservative 10-year estimate. So to answer some of the questions, when do the repairs have to be made? It's, you want to plan. And if it's nearing the end, you want to start planning for it, because the last thing you want is a catastrophic failure of, if there is a fire and the fire protection system hasn't been properly maintained and it's not up to snuff, it's going to fail and then you have a bigger disaster on your hand. So it's up to your manager and say your maintenance supervisors to be walking the building and working with Scott, the engineer, to understand where you are in the useful life and what's working, where you are in those repairs and things of that nature. But the board still has the ability to finance a repair. So if we get, if we need to replace completely the fire protection system as our example, then you can reach out to banks and finance those. They don't have to be just based on what's in your structural integrity reserve study.
Brian, what you touched upon now, I think, is also causing me to think about other things, especially in these days of high inflation and supply chain issues and rising construction costs and whatnot. And you look at the statute, it tells you that you've got to do a structural integrity reserve study every 10 years. Okay, but a lot can change in 10 years. The figures you get today on that study will significantly change if you repeated that study, I would say 2 years from now, and they may take into account factors such as environmental issues, periodic maintenance or upkeep, or that you do on those building components. Estimated replacement costs might differ because of supply chain issues, or cost of raw materials, or inflationary constraints. And so I stop and wonder, we talk about doing this by law every 10 years, but is it prudent to do this and revisit this more often, more regularly? Historically, just your standard reserve studies, the conventional, recommendations and the industry recommendations were to do them every 3 years. So does it make sense, and Scott might be able to chime in on this, does it make sense to hire your architects and engineers to give you a baseline structural integrity reserve study and then have it either updated or have another look at it, within 2 or 3 years, just to avoid the possible concerns that might arise if you are reserving for 10 years without revisiting it, and then come to find out that you're woefully underfunded, God forbid, or, while it's unlikely, but possible, that you're overfunding, and maybe you can benefit from adjusting downward some of what those figures are. I mean, this is not included in the statutes, but I raise a question about whether that might make sense to do more regularly than every 10 years.
Yeah, I think in line with that thought, usually when somebody gets a reserve, especially from me, we say every year or every other year to maybe just have a quick refresh of the reserve. Like you said, things could break or conditions could change, or maybe a certain element is performing better than expected, right? So
a hurricane arrives and maybe stresses out the building a little bit.
Yeah, so a hurricane arises is a good time to have an inspection done afterwards to see if there's any issues or weaknesses that event showed up. But in the spirit of the law, which we keep talking about, is the buildings are living, right? They have useful lives. These elements don't last forever. The car is a good illustration. We don't just drive the car till it explodes or breaks down and just leave the key and walk on. You check it periodically to make sure that you don't have anything catastrophic happen. So if you have a building, and let's say it's a large building or any building of any scale, it is prudent to have a professional be advising the owners throughout the process or life of the building. So a little bit spent every year may save a lot in the long run, as opposed to, like Roberto said, maybe getting a study done. And let's say in the worst case scenario, the study has left something out, then 10 years down the line, you may have a major repair that you didn't even know should have been included, right? Or something may be overlooked that comes as a surprise to the unit owners. So I think if anything can be taken from this webinar, is just to seek professional guidance. Don't wait till the end, because every building is different. The jurisdictions are different. Some people ask, like, who generates the reports or who sends these letters out? It's the city, right? That the building is in, that's going to send out this letter to the actual condominium or building. It's going to say you have X amount of time. That municipality may be different than somewhere else, and so it's really a personal thing to the building to understand where you are in the stream of time and what you have to do, as opposed to trying to interpret it yourself. So I think that may be the best advice, is just get professional help. And it doesn't have to be a huge amount of help, but definitely getting somebody involved to take a look at the building should be prudent on everybody on the call.
So I'm going to ask one last question. We're wrapping up. We have a couple minutes left, and then we'll do a quick closing roundtable very quickly. If after the phase 1 or phase 2 inspection is done by Scott, and an issue, one of the questions that came across, the balconies need to be repaired. Do those repairs need to be done before December 24th, or do they need to just show a proactive approach? We have the inspection, we are working to obtaining a contractor and working on getting it, because it's a long process. You're not talking a 2-week window to get all the balconies on some of these larger buildings repaired. Do those all need to be completed by December 24th, or just show the proactive?
No, the timeline right now is just, you need to complete your inspection by X date. And that's the phase 1, right? So if you have to move into a phase 2, then the jurisdiction is just needs to know that the professional is guiding you through it, and the correspondence should come from the professional saying, we're doing a phase 2, here's what's involved, we're now prescribing repairs, we're now bidding the job, we're now conducting it. A large project may take a year, 2 years to be done, right? So I think what the governing jurisdictions want to know is that you are actually proactively doing what it takes to get the repair done right and being guided by the right professional.
And as it relates, it's not in the section pertaining to structural integrity reserve studies, but it is in the milestone inspection section. It says that the Board of County Commissioners, I guess, that has jurisdiction over the property, has the right to establish ordinances to govern the timeframes within which concerns identified in a milestone inspection need to be commenced to be repaired or scheduled for repair. In the absence of those ordinances being formed, the statute does give you a period of 365 days from the issuance of the report. So that's to be considered.
Right. So again, we're running out of time here, and I want to thank our two panelists, Scott and Roberto, and I also want to thank everybody that joined. There's a bunch of questions that came in that we were unfortunately not able to get to each and every one. But we're going to download that, and we're going to provide those responses to all those attendees. I think Scott alluded to it at his last comment, which was start the process now. Get with an engineer, get with your manager, get with your legal counsel, and start the process. It's all about that partnership, being able to sit around a table and start talking through some of these. If you as a board and the property management have maybe deferred a lot of this maintenance, you may have a little bit more work in front of you right now. If you've done a lot of the routine maintenance and you kept your building going strong, and like our car analogy, then you may have a little bit less. But each and every building is different. So I would just start that process now, hire an engineer, make sure that legal counsel is on board and they're up to speed on everything that you've been doing. And then basically as this process unfolds over the next 18, 24 months, you're going to have to start getting some of these things probably completed. Obviously the milestone inspections in phase 1 and phase 2. Any closing arguments, Roberto?
Well, I'm going to try not to make it an argument, but I first want to thank you and Scott and Marines as well for assisting in putting this together. I think we're navigating through these very new concepts that were introduced. I think the overall objective is a very good and a very fresh objective, and like with any new concept and idea for the greater public good, it's going to have some wrinkles ironed out throughout the process. So we should be on the lookout for that. And to the point you mentioned earlier, being proactive and being diligent in maintenance and the upkeep of buildings will, in all likelihood, avoid any significant, heartache or expense or trouble when it comes to something like this. I also want to get back, Brian, to something you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which is, this natural phenomenon that we're involved in right now, this hurricane, and how it's going to impact us. I'm taking a look at the list of the buildings and stakeholders that we've got on this call, and I noticed that a good amount of these participants are very likely going to be in areas of our state that are going to be, unfortunately, but significantly impacted by the storm. Rodents come out when these storms pass, and I'm not talking about literal rodents. I'm talking about people that prey on victims of these storms. I'm talking about people that fly in from other states and other jurisdictions, contractors, purported insurance adjusters. Be weary of all those people. Do not sign any paper. Do not sign any contract. Do not sign any commitment. Call the lawyers, call the property managers with whom you work. If you don't work with a lawyer, or you don't think your lawyer is familiar with this process, reach out to Brian, reach out to Castle. They're going to be ready to assist you guys. They'll put you in touch with qualified adjusters, qualified lawyers, qualified engineers, qualified accountants that can assist you in this process. Please, 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 we see it after every single storm. Do not feel obligated to sign anything unless you understand exactly what it states, until you've had your lawyer take a look at it and you speak to your property manager about it, because we don't want victims to become even greater victims as a result of these catastrophes. Please, if you need to, call me, send me an email. If I know it's not going to happen, Brian will be available, but we want to make sure that nobody is abused as a result of these unfortunate circumstances.
Thank you very much. Scott?
You guys wrapped up really nicely. I think I learned a lot listening to Roberto, listening to you from a different realm. I think hopefully those that tuned in learned something, and there's going to be many more questions, but I think if anybody wants to take anything away, it's going to take a team, right? You need your attorneys, just like you need your engineers, you need your property managers. Don't try to tackle it alone. And the more work you do up front in the right way, with the right guidance, the smoother the journey is going to be, right? And let's not neglect how local jurisdictions may have different nuances than the law. And we just need to tackle this together and just make sure it's done right, and not forget what the overall intent is, which is to have safe buildings that really last the test of time and are safe for all the users. So I appreciate the time, appreciate the company, and I look forward to learning more and sharing more.
Great. Thank you both very much. And again, as Roberto alluded to, stay safe out there. The entire state of Florida is going to be impacted in some form by Hurricane Ian. So please stay safe. Hopefully your family stays safe. And we'll see you on the next webinar. Thank you very much.